Commission to order. Secretary Burgess, are there any changes to the final agenda?
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. There are no changes to today's agenda.
Thank you. So with that, we'll move to the items on the regular agenda. The first item for discussion is item 401, case 17W0528, which is the Suez Water Owego Nichols rate plan presented by Administrative Law Judge Sean Mullaney. John Scherer, Deputy Director, Office of Accounting, Audits and Finance, and Mike Reeder, Chief Gas and Water Rates and Supply, are available for questions. Judge Mullaney, please begin.
Good morning, Chair Rhodes and Commissioners. Item 401 would adopt the terms of a joint proposal and establish a 3-year water rate plan for Suez Water Owego Nichols. The joint proposal is sponsored by the company and department trial staff, which are the only two parties in this proceeding. This is a major rate case. Suez Water Owego Nichols' initial rate filing, made on August 25, 2017, sought an increase in the company's annual revenue requirement of approximately $600,000, or 33.4%. The requested increase would have resulted in a monthly bill increase of $12.08, or 40.4% increase for the average residential customer. 2 public statement hearings were held on November 8, 2017 in Owego, New York. The Tioga County Industrial Development Agency opposed Suez Water's initial rate filing, based primarily on concerns that it would negatively impact existing and prospective businesses within the company's service territory. After conducting discovery, staff filed its testimony on December 15, 2017, and the company filed rebuttal testimony on January 12, 2018. Staff then filed surrebuttal testimony on January 31, 2018 to address the company's proposed response to the announced closure of Suez Water's largest customer, Sanmina SCI Corporation. Sanmina was responsible for almost 50% of the throughput of Suez Water's system, and Sanmina-related revenue accounted for approximately 23.6% of the company's total operating revenue. Shortly after filing its rebuttal testimony, Suez filed a notice of impending settlement negotiations as per the requirements under Commission Rule 3.9. All parties were provided a fair opportunity to participate in those negotiations. The JP was filed on March 30, 2018. The company and staff filed statements in support on April 20, 2018, and an evidentiary hearing was held on May 21, 2018. And I would note for the record that pursuant to the Public Service Law, Commissioner Berman was present at the evidentiary hearing. At that hearing, the joint proposal and statements in support were entered into the record. I also would note that there's no opposition to the joint proposal. The joint proposal would establish a 3-year rate plan. Rate year 1 would be the 12 months ending July 31, 2019. Rate year 2 would be July 31, 2020, and rate year 3 would end on July 31, 2021. The JP recognizes the company's revenue requirement as follows: an increase in revenues of $296,962 in rate year 1, an increase of $56,210 in rate year 2, and an increase of $65,477 in rate year 3. As you can see, that the increase is much larger in rate year 1, so to mitigate the rate impacts of these increases, the company would recover the revenue increases through rates on a levelized basis with interest as follows. In rate year 1, the company would collect $168,788. In rate year 2, Suez would collect $186,250, and in rate year 3, Suez would collect $205,520. As a result of this approach, customers overall would experience a rate increase of 10.3% in each of the 3 rate years. The typical residential customer with a monthly usage of 500 cubic 100 feet right? Cubic feet, or roughly 3,740 gallons, would see an average bill increase of 11.5% per year. These increases are based upon agreed-upon adjustments to operating revenues, operation and maintenance expenses, rate base, and based on a capital structure having 46% common equity and a return on equity of 8.9%. The authorized return on equity of 8.9% includes a 30 basis point stay-out premium. I just want to talk briefly about the impact of the closure of the San Mina plant. In anticipation of the closure of that plant, the company and staff proposed rates premised on the assumption that a successor company would be found to replace 75% of the revenues previously paid by San Mina. Both the company and staff have recommended this approach as a reasonable way to balance the company's need for revenues against the rate impacts that would have resulted if the company were allowed to immediately begin collecting all of the lost San Mina revenues from its remaining customers. At the evidentiary hearing, the witness panel, sponsored by the company and staff, testified that allowing immediate recovery of all the lost San Mina revenues would have resulted in a rate increase of approximately 42%. At the time the company and staff agreed to this approach, that is, basing the rates on the replacement of 75% of San Mina's revenues, the company and local officials were actively seeking a successor company having a similar need for water to take San Mina's place. Those negotiations, however, were not successful. In order to balance the company's resulting need for revenues against the rate impacts on customers, the JP proposes the sharing of San Mina revenue shortfalls between the company and its customers. If there is a shortfall, in rate year 1, the sharing would be 90-10 customer and company. And the JP calls for a 95-5 sharing in rate years 2 and 3. There is a 100% reconciliation of shortfalls if the company stays out longer than the 3-year rate plan. Since you cannot reconcile actual revenues to the forecast until the rate year is complete, if there is a revenue shortfall, the resulting surcharge would be implemented in the following rate year. For example, if there was a rate year 1 San Mina related revenue shortfall, the company would collect 90% of that shortfall through a surcharge that would go into effect at some point in rate year 2. The sharing is only for shortfalls in revenue. If the successor company exceeds 75% of San Mina's revenues, the customers would receive 100% of the benefits related to the excess revenues. Thereafter, Suez could recover all of its authorized revenues from its existing customers. The company is planning on making a filing in the spring of 2019 in which Suez would propose merging all of its New York-based operating companies. If the company files for new rates to become effective before the end of the 3-year rate plan proposed in this item, the amount of the stay-out premium will be reduced accordingly. I would also note that the joint proposal includes provisions calling for the sharing of excess revenues between the company and ratepayers. And this is the sort of revenue sharing mechanism or earnings sharing mechanism that the Commission has adopted in other cases. It's incremental. The Commission's approval of the joint proposal would be in the public interest. The joint proposal is the result of a full and fair process that afforded all parties in the public ample opportunities to participate and comment, both on Suez Water's initial rate filing and on the joint proposal. No party opposes the joint proposal, and public comments have been very limited. The joint proposal will produce results that compare favorably to the range of potential outcomes from resulting from a fully litigated case, and it reasonably balances the company's immediate need for revenues against the rate impacts that would otherwise occur as a result of the closure of the San Mina plant. Through the San Mina revenue collection mechanism, the company and customers will each bear a portion of the risk of San Mina-related revenue shortfalls. The levelized rate design under the 3-year rate plan will mitigate the impacts of the rate increases. For these reasons, Commission approval of the proposed order is recommended. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judge Mullaney. My own take is that this is a sensible and balanced resolution of a difficult issue. It secures the investments needed to provide good service to these water utility customers at a reasonable and, I will add, much reduced from the initial ask rate increase. I will be voting in favor of this item. Commissioner Sayre?
I think you all probably know that I tend to be a fan of multi-year rate plans and settlements, as long as they are fully negotiated by conflicting parties. I think that the parties are likely to come up with a balance that's in the public interest that is at least as likely to be a good result as a fully litigated rate case where the Commission has to rule on each and every issue. As long as we take a hard look at every settlement, and we've taken a good look at this settlement, and I think it passes our test. A settlement like this also has the advantage over a one-year rate case of establishing a multi-year plan, which benefits ratepayers by spreading out the increases and avoids additional rate cases for several years into the future. I support it.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman?
Thank you. The Commission has a broad mandate to ensure consumers receive safe and reliable utility service at reasonable rates and with least adverse effect upon the environment. And the Commission must balance that public need for virtually essential core services against the private needs of the shareholder to ensure continued investment in these services. Critically important is the public interest in this. We need to carefully weigh the rate adjustments and look at the benefits to the customers. A water company is allowed to recover prudent and reasonable operating expenses and is assuming an efficient operation to earn a fair return on invested capital. When we look to a joint proposal, standard of review, which is outlined in the order, talks about the balancing the protection of the consumers, fairness to investors, and the long-term viability of the utility. Has to be consistent with the environmental, social, and economic policies of the Commission and the state, and it should produce results that are within the range of reasonable results that would have likely arisen from a Commission decision in a litigated proceeding. That's our legal authority. We need to carefully weigh it. In this case, it takes a significant amount of focus and looking at the detail, and it's really the bread and butter of what we do as a Commission. We're economic regulators at our core, and we're focused on the consumer and the protection of those public interests. For us, this is an essential service and something that we need to do. The loss of a major and the largest customer for this utility is so significant that it changes the whole dynamics of the utility rate structure and makes us have to look at it. And it makes us have to remind ourselves, or at least for me, it reminds me that the importance of looking and the importance of the economic regulation that we do. I do think that this is the best outcome, but it also concerns me about other losses of other large customers that may be out there that we don't know. In this case, this was done in a way that we were able to look at it within the rate case and to try to make some adjustments, and also to look at it from a phase-in perspective that was helpful. And this isn't necessarily the end. As you said, in the spring 2018, there will be potentially looking at the consolidation and what that means. We need to be ever mindful that this is not unique. In this case, it just so happens that this large customer impact and the loss of that customer is so significant. And the upward rate pressure is something that we have to consider across the board and looking at all of what we do. So I am in support of this because I think it does meet the objectives, but I also am very mindful that this is significant and difficult for the customers and for the company who's trying to balance all of that. And the loss of that customer is significant. So, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Alisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to support this. I believe that it is in the public interest to approach it this way. I think there's a reasonable balance, a reasonable amount of risk sharing, less of an immediate impact on the ratepayers, and overall, I think it's a sound approach, so I'll be supporting the issue.
Thank you very much. We will proceed to, I'll proceed to call for a vote. My vote is in favor of the recommendation to adopt a 3-year rate plan for water service as discussed. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Alisi, how do you vote?
Aye.
The item is approved and the recommendations are adopted. We will now move to the second item for discussion, which is item 101, case 17G0606, which is the Consolidated Edison Smart Solutions for Natural Gas Customers Program, presented by Cindy McCarron, Deputy Director, Gas and Water, and Peggy Neville, Deputy Director, Office of Clean Energy. We will let them arrive.
Okay. Good morning, Chair Rhodes and Commissioners. The draft order before you addresses a petition filed by Con Edison Company of New York, or Con Ed, who proposes a new natural gas program called Smart Solutions. The program includes an enhanced gas energy efficiency program, a new gas demand response program, a new innovation program to encourage renewable alternatives to natural gas heating technologies, and a new market solicitation for non-pipes alternatives, otherwise known as NPAs. Also, Con Ed proposes to recover incurred pipeline development costs for a planned gas pipeline project in the event such a project is terminated before completion. This program is intended to help address Con Ed's forecasted growing shortfall of peak day pipeline capacity. Con Ed is experiencing both significant growth in customer demand on its natural gas system, as well as significant stakeholder opposition to the types of projects it would traditionally engage in to meet natural gas load growth. Smart Solutions represents a significant departure from business as usual and represents a step in the process to reduce our reliance on natural gas and meet our state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. The draft order before you recommends approval of the Enhanced Gas Energy Efficiency Program with modifications, which Peggy Neville will discuss now.
Thanks, Cindy. Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. In recognition of the role energy efficiency can play in reducing peak day gas demands, Con Edison proposed a doubling of their existing successful energy efficiency programs, referred to as ETIPs, for 2018 and 19. Staff supports the doubling of the existing annual targets. However, upon review of the company's current performance, staff finds that a doubling of the existing budget is not warranted, as Con Edison has been able to deliver program savings at a lesser cost than originally forecasted. As a result, the item before you recommends a combined annual budget and target for the existing ETIP programs and the Enhanced Gas EE programs at approximately $20 million, with a target of approximately 607,000 MMBTUs per year, and a new target focused on peak day reduction of 5,000 MMBTU per day. As the expanded gas EE program will be integrated and delivered with the existing ETIP programs, staff also recommends these budgets and targets extend through 2020, the current term of the ETIP. The order directs Con Edison to reallocate approximately $8.2 million of their unspent energy efficiency portfolio standard gas funds to be used in combination with existing authorized ETIP funds to achieve these goals, resulting in no new ratepayer collections through 2020. It is recommended that Con Edison be directed to revise its ETIP filing within 30 days to reflect the revised budgets and targets established in this draft order.
Regarding the recovery of costs related to a future pipeline project, this draft order recommends that Con Ed's request for cost recovery of shared pipeline development costs be denied. Projects that are not implemented or not in service never become used and useful assets that serve our natural gas utilities on behalf of gas customers, and those development costs remain with the pipeline developers that made their own determinations to take on those associated risks. The draft order doesn't recommend approval of funding related to the proposed innovation program, but it does provide criteria that Con Ed should use in developing such programs as part of any future filing before you. At this time, there is not sufficient information for staff to make a recommendation on funding related to the innovation program. The draft order before you also does not make recommendations regarding the demand response program or possible NPA projects, although staff expects to bring those parts of the Smart Solution filing to the Commission at future sessions. Nonetheless, it is important to get the Enhanced Energy Efficiency Program started and also to send the proper signal related to the development costs of any future pipeline project. Peggy and I will be happy to take any questions on this draft order.
Thank you, Cindy and Peggy. This is, as are most of our topics, one where, really what we're doing is a search for viable solutions. I concur that what we have in front of us is an important and useful step forward to advance energy efficiency as it relates to natural gas in a manner that will yield dividends for customers and for the system that we will be very glad of. I also like the idea of innovative solutions, whether they come in the form of demonstration projects or non-pipe alternatives or demand response advances. And I have very high expectations that when these show up, they will be well developed, well grounded, and aimed at valuable and important outcomes. And so I think it's very good that we are establishing clear and useful criteria as the basis for that. And I agree as a matter of prudence and philosophy with the recommendation on pre-development costs. So I will be voting for this item. Commissioner Sayre.
I am always happy to see energy efficiency measures increasingly extended to gas beyond electricity, especially where there's no additional cost to customers from this expansion of the program, and where the program does reduce the need for new construction in the future, which is a benefit for all customers. Although we are not approving all parts of Con Ed's proposal, primarily because some of these parts are not yet fully developed, I do support Con Ed's goals of seeking further efficiencies and non-pipes alternatives, and I look forward to future filings along these lines by Con Ed and other gas utilities. I support the item.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman?
I think it's commendable of the company seeking to address their gas issues and try to figure out innovative ways of addressing that. The problem is with gas capacity, and this order doesn't address it. EIA is predicting, or has predicted, that natural gas consumption and growth is on a significant increase, and demand is seen rising to record highs in 2018. There's a significant need from, or desire of, industrial customers in particular to have the gas that they need, even when they have a diverse fuel portfolio, and it works, the integration of fuels with the renewable portfolio. A natural gas-fired electricity generation this summer, as according to EIA, is expected to be near record high, and that may mean that there may be a problem to meet generation demand and fill upstream storage for winter LDC use. It's something we need to consider and figure out. There is in the petition that was brought forward by Con Ed, talked about the fact that it was implicitly in line with where EIA is. It's not unique to Con Ed, and it is a growing problem. The company is forecasting a growing shortfall of peak gas day pipeline capacity. I believe that this order recognizes that. There was some commentary from other parties questioning that. But I don't think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that is correct. Their forecast appears accurate, and there is going to be a growing shortfall of peak gas day pipeline capacity. And they need additional pipeline capacity and/or maybe a combination way to balance the supply and demand on the natural gas system. Because of this natural gas growth in Con Ed territory increasing and expected to continue, the transitioning to gas is tricky. Con Ed has right now 1.1 million gas customers in its territory. New York has over nearly 5 million gas customers. And when we look at that, we need to see, what do we do with this transition to gas? There are reasons that it's beneficial. It's beneficial from an environmental perspective. The Clean Heat program has been very successful. There are value propositions for gas. The costs are low, and the reliability of the natural gas supply is imperative. But there are barriers, and Con Ed recognized that. And this order was a really cry for help, and a recognition that because of that, they need to figure out how to do things differently. But we also need to recognize that one of those barriers is that the companies can't get necessary permits. And that has had a negative effect. There are definitely issues, and because of that, Con Ed said that they have to factor that in, and therefore de facto it's deemed not viable, even if they are viable except for that. We're the economic regulator that needs to look at all of those issues and needs to figure it out, and we also have a duty to help the utilities provide the gas for the customers that want them and that need them. There are uncertainties that are creating problems, and because of that, folks are modifying their behavior. This is not new. Con Ed has been modifying the behavior on how they deal with pipelines. In 2016, we recognized that. In 2014. We recognized that before we were here, when there's been issues, and trying to balance that need. The commission was set up for the protection of consumers. The commission was set up to look at the essential core services, whether that's electric, gas, steam, telecommunications, water. And to the extent that there are customers who want that, and we are trying to figure out the proper balance, we need to take a careful look at that. We are handicapping Con Ed right now by only agreeing to do part of this. One of the reasons that they asked for cost recovery is because they are very mindful of the fact that there are pipeline developers who are not willing to come into New York for the regulatory uncertainty. I don't necessarily know that Con Ed's request for cost recovery was right, but it was right to raise the issue and to say that we have a concern, and this is our best way of trying to address that from a cost recovery perspective to entice those who may not want to be here. So for us, we need to then take a careful look at what are the barriers and what are the opportunities, because we do need to figure out the transition to renewables in a way that is thoughtful and in a way that is not going to be concerning when we have reliability and resiliency issues. Con Ed is already, in this petition, talks about the potential for more moratoriums and what that may mean. Again, I don't believe it's unique to Con Ed. That means that we as economic regulators need to take a pause and be prepared to address that. Back in October of 1971, the commission, that commission at that time, had to address determining whether and to what extent restrictions on the attachment of new gas customers, what that looked like, should be imposed, looking at supplying of additional gas volumes to existing customers and how to address that, and limiting sales and the promotion of that, and trying to make some critical decisions. It isn't just, and as I looked at what was done, it isn't just a stopping for new gas customers. The impact on existing customers can be significant, and it could be dire if we don't have the proper fuel that they need. Unless a user of natural gas has available facilities capable of using an alternative fuel, which may also not be as environmentally friendly as gas, the interruption of their gas supply can have devastating effects. That's what the Commission found in 1971 when they were facing this, and I don't believe that the facts change when we have to look at what we're doing when we're starting to do some curtailments on gas and some concerns. Industries and commercial establishments may need to cease operations, and residential customers may lack heat in the coldest winter months. So we need to be prepared to look at that. Some of the facts that I don't have is who are we turning away? Who are the utilities turning away? Have customers asked, or have new customers asked for gas? Have current customers asked to expand? We have a queue for interconnections on solar and other renewables, and work through that process and where they are in that queue. But we don't actually have a queue that looks at what the expected install date may be, if it's meeting it, what the concerns are, why they're not. We don't necessarily have a true handle on what it may mean for some of our high needs gas customers like hospitals and schools and others. And to the extent that those are some of the strategic alignments that we need to make sure that we are properly prepared so that the utilities will continue providing the necessary service without a major disruption, and also looking at it while we're working through some of the challenges in looking at other alternatives. I think it is important to look at viable non-pipes alternatives and technology and innovations, but that also means that we need to have a recognition that the viability of it and the reasonableness of it and what it means in the larger mix. So that we need to have an understanding from the beginning on how much pipe, how much expansion, and work through that. Again, if customers want it and it's economical to do so, our role is to figure out that way. We may not necessarily have full agreement, but the customers have the choice to choose the fuel that they want. And if it's in an area and a franchise that is providing that, we need to figure it out. For me, I want to make sure that we're doing all we can to be prepared. And I want to make sure that we're doing all we can to figure out now rather than waiting, and have more information. To the extent that we're saying to Con Ed that they didn't give us enough information for some of their innovative programs, and therefore we're going to not adopt it now. I think that the message could be flipped. We support them in that, and we want to figure out what else is needed. In some ways, I see it as here, this order is lacking in looking at the proper forecasting hand in hand in collaboration with the utility and, more importantly, with the customers who want gas and the customers who want to transition off of gas, and working through that and what that may mean and what the right subset is. I think there's a way we can do it. I'm going to be voting for this item because I do think that there are things in here that are important and the signal is right, but I want there to be no mistake. I am very concerned, and I think that we need to do all we can as economic regulators and as good environmental stewards to make sure that we are working hand in hand to figure out the solutions and not to be handicapping the utilities, but more importantly, not to be handicapping the customers.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Alisi?
Thank you. I have nothing to add.
So thank you very much. I will proceed to call for a vote on this item. My vote is in favor of the recommendation to approve with modification the Enhanced Gas Energy Efficiency Program as discussed, and to establish criteria for the Gas Innovation Program as discussed. Commissioner Sayer, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
I concur with my comments.
Commissioner Alisi, how do you vote?
Aye.
The item is approved and the recommendations are adopted. With that, thank you, everybody. With that, we will move to the next item for discussion. This is item 301, case 15E 0751 et al., which is the Low-Income Community Distributed Generation Initiatives, presented by Marty and Sonia, Chief Consumer Advocacy. Ted Kelly, Assistant Counsel, is available for questions. Marty, please begin.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Rhodes. Good morning, Commissioners. In the Value of Distributed Energy Resources, or VDER, transition order, the Commission directed staff to work with utilities and stakeholders to develop solutions to encourage low-income participation in community distributed generation, or CDG, under the VDER tariffs. A low-income working group was established and met over the course of several months to examine barriers and to access and develop solutions. Using information and suggestions from that effort, staff submitted a low-income community distributed generation proposal in December of last year, and numerous parties submitted comments on the staff proposal. This order would adopt the recommendations of the staff report with certain modifications. As a principal strategy to expand opportunities for low-income households to subscribe to CDG projects, the order would adopt a bill discount pledge program to subsidize subscription fees for low-income customers. This would allow low-income customers to use a share of their monthly affordability program bill discounts towards the purchase of CDG subscriptions, reducing or eliminating the need for low-income customers to pay subscription fees out of pocket. While foregoing the benefit of the discounted bill, the participating low-income customers would instead offset a portion of their monthly bills through CDG bill credits. The Bill Discount Pledge Program has the potential to directly address one of the principal market barriers that we've identified facing CDG projects seeking to serve low-income customers, that of non-payment risk. It would do so by furnishing CDG developers with a reliable and credit-worthy revenue stream associated with low-income customers, which would be paid directly to the developer from the utility. An important feature of the Bill Discount Pledge Program is that it works within the rate levels and benefits of the current affordability programs and therefore remains revenue neutral for other ratepayers. Another key feature of the Bill Discount Pledge Program is that participating CDG developers would have to guarantee that CDG credits on an annual basis would be equal to or greater than the foregone portion of the bill discount. Such a demonstration would be made in a petition to the Commission for authorization to serve low-income customers under the Bill Discount Pledge Program, which would be similar to the authorization that the Commission requires for ESCOs to serve low-income customers. These petitions would include commitments to provide certain other consumer protections that would be specific to the Bill Discount Pledge Program as laid out in the order. The order envisions an important role for utilities in Bill Discount Pledge implementation and administration. Among other things, in addition to application of CDG bill credits to customer accounts, the utilities would be called upon to make the payments to CDG developers of the funds pledged by low-income customers to cover subscription fees and to enroll any eligible customers identified by the CDG developer or their partner organizations who are not currently enrolled in the utilities affordability program. More on that in a moment. The order would direct utilities to make filings to implement the Bill Discount Pledge Program. After a comment period, it is expected that the Commission would consider and act on those implementation plans. Now, we expect that many CDG projects that serve low-income customers may be developed to serve a particular geographic area, for example, a disadvantaged community. This suggests a potential role for community-based organizations in promoting CDG projects in those areas, and utilities will be required to enroll any eligible customers identified by the CDG developer or their community partners who are not currently enrolled in their affordability programs. To facilitate that enrollment, the order would direct NYSERDA to extend its income verification service to CDG developers who are seeking to verify eligibility of prospective low-income subscribers. NYSERDA currently conducts income verification for its income-eligible programs and is currently examining ways to lower the costs of income verification. Extending this service to CDG developers would facilitate the development of CDG projects designed to serve disadvantaged communities and further would serve to expand the reach of the Commission's affordability programs. Finally, given that lack of access to capital is a major barrier for low-income customers to invest in renewable projects, policies that would directly address the issue of financing and credit risk could have a significant impact on increasing low-income participation. A loss reserve could reduce the credit requirements lenders impose for low-income consumers to access subscriptions to CDG projects, as well as reducing financing barriers for CDG developers of such projects. Now, a loss reserve is simply a fund set aside to cover losses incurred under a portfolio of loans. Loss reserves have long been used to reduce risks from both conventional and novel investments and could be used here to attract financing for CDG projects serving low-income participants. In its most recent business plan, which was filed on June 29th, the New York Green Bank states that it is considering issuing a request for proposals to provide loss reserves or other financial solutions to CDG projects serving low and moderate income communities. The order would direct NYSERDA through the Green Bank or other appropriate portfolio to create a loss reserve program for CDG projects serving low-income subscribers and to file a report on the status of development of that program within 6 months. With this order, the Commission would be taking major steps to ensure that the opportunities created by the VDER and CDG initiatives are available to all New Yorkers. The Bill Discount Pledge Program will ensure that low-income New Yorkers who do not have the ability to pay an additional monthly fee can participate in CDG programs by providing a guaranteed payment stream from the utility to the developer. The income verification service will support New York's goal of including all eligible customers in low-income programs and will support engagement of community-based organizations. And finally, the loss reserve will further ensure that credit quality does not serve as a barrier to CDG membership. And Ted and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Marty. I welcome this item. I find that these recommendations represent important concrete steps to enable access to an important and desired resource, in keeping with our premise and also our promise that REV is for all New Yorkers. I think the recommendations have found a way that is not just access effective, but also cost effective and also customer protective. Here I'm thinking about the bill discount pledge and about the loan loss reserve. And I also conclude that income verification is a decisive and helpful way of streamlining, which is always a good step to take. I will be in favor of this item. Commissioner Sarah? Yeah.
I fully agree with the chair's comments. I commend staff on its hard work on this project. It's been very difficult to ensure that low and moderate income ratepayers can have a chance at the same benefits that more affluent customers can obtain from distributed generation projects such as community solar. This item takes a big step to redress that deficiency, and I'm very pleased to support it.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman.
First, I want to thank staff. I think that they have worked very hard in trying to address a lot of the consumer issues. It's a credit to all the staff working on it, but in particular the consumer services folks who I know have really lived and breathed this way before we even talked about community DG. I also want to thank and particularly note that I'm particularly impressed with UIU's continued advocacy and engagement on these issues. I think it's very important. It helps me as a regulator with the thoughtfulness that is conveyed in their papers and looking at it in trying to make some determinations of what this is. For me, it's about what is the real impact we're having. In this case, it's low-income consumers. And what is the real impact that we're going to have in this? We have struggled with community DG for a long time. Frankly, I think that the parties have struggled with us and some of the potential challenges in the regulatory structure to make community DG work. And there's a balance that needs to be in place with that and figuring it out and what the impact is on the systems and the grid in the penetration of distributed generation, but now in community DG, and what exactly, who's actually benefiting, and if the benefits are being done actually for the consumer, I think is very important, and what that direct takeaway is. I do have some sort of questions on the item and really making sure that I fully understand it and exactly what we're doing. With the bill discount pledge, there does need to be, in my mind, a match-up with other low-income programs that we're doing and with the utilities and the adjustments that are being made. Again, upward adjustments in rates across the board can be significant, and how that works in where we are across the board with our low-income programs, and in particular making sure that we are aligning those programs and those measures in an effective way for the customer, and making sure that it actually is helping. I have seen many times where programs are advertised, and in fact what happens is that there might not necessarily be a large pool of participants that can take advantage of it, or if they try to, the barriers are difficult. And with many of our low-income programs from the state, we have struggled with making sure that we are doing an effective job once it leaves our realm. So I am about making sure that we have true focused accountability and measuring and evaluating that, especially if we are going to be spending dollars, ratepayer dollars in particular, on programs in making sure that they are effective and robust. As to the bill discount pledge program, I did note from the order and from the parties that the folks that are not eligible is potentially a lot when you back out the master metered and sub-metered. And that really means, in my mind, that we're not really looking at a robust program in New York City. Is that fair?
If the question is, are there a lot of low-income households who are not currently enrolled in utility programs that we haven't identified, I would say that in New York City, that's probably the least impacted because the Con Edison and now the Keyspan Energy Delivery New York, or what I still call Brooklyn Union, one of the old guys, the Brooklyn Union companies, their respective affordability programs reach a broad range of eligible customers. They serve customers who are participants in any one of 8 different Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance programs. So, at least in New York City, it should not be an issue.
And certainly there are a significant percentage of the low-income population in New York City is master metered and sub-metered, which in that case wouldn't the bill discount pledge wouldn't be available to those populations. But because New York City has such a large population, even the relatively smaller percentage of direct metered low-income customers is a substantial population, and therefore there should be a relatively large number of potential participants in the Con Edison area. And staff is still considering and working on the issue of extending the benefits of CDG to sub-metered populations in particular. That's one area that we're still giving a lot of thought to and hope to come to you with recommendations at some point in the future.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. Because the outcomes for the bill discount pledge vary across utility service territories, it appears to me that maybe some of the low-income customers may be more attractive to CDG developers and BDB subscribers than others. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think that's true, partly because of the variation in the size of bill discounts, but also just because of the variation of the value of credits, either under net metering or under the VETR system in each utility territory. So sort of in general, there's more availability to potential subscribers in, for example, Orange and Rockland, Central Hudson, and NYSEG as compared to Con Edison, just because they're more attractive places for developers to build projects right now.
Okay. So really then the benefit of participating in the program is not going to be felt necessarily uniformly across the state, but that also means that we need to be cognizant of the fact that the program itself and the penetration in certain service territories may be significant and needs to also be looked at in terms of the penetration of that.
I think that is something that only time will tell. So, we'll see if there are certain territories where this program is more effective than others. Then we'd have to, consider what other steps might be appropriate.
Right, but also the challenges from a reliability and resiliency perspective, depending on how much DG and how much CDG goes into a particular area. Is that correct?
So from a reliability and resiliency perspective, that is something that staff keeps a close eye on. We don't see any concerns in any of the utility territories at this time, and don't don't believe that, based on the current queues, it's something that is likely to arise directly, but it's something that we will absolutely continue to keep a close eye on as more projects are built to ensure that the resiliency and reliability of the grid is maintained.
Okay. I guess the termination of at this time is subject to ambiguity.
Certainly, each project is subject to an interconnection study that looks at any local impacts like that, and then we have a more, we also take a broader look at potential service territory-wide impacts.
Okay, thank you. There's also a need for the fleshing out of the implementation. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like?
Well, I think the major points of implementation we covered in our presentation. So a key piece of it will be processing of the payments of subscription fees that low-income customers pledge through the bill discount program to their CDG developer. We're asking the utilities to explain the mechanics of that process in their implementation plan filings. It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all. One utility may have different utilities may have different ways of accomplishing that. So we'll look at that when we get those filings.
Okay, so just so you know, I would anticipate the 60 days is not being, it's a lot for utilities to have to do within 60 days. And to the extent that there needs to be a thoughtful, robust implementation plan that is focused on making sure that the potential customers and the developers that may want to take advantage of this have a good opportunity. I'm just pausing at this within 60 days because I think it's a real tight time frame for a lot. And my concern is with CDG and with low income, again, we have been very clunky in the addressing of these issues. And from the beginning, back in 2014 to now, we can point to numerous different actions that have tried to address it and made significant changes, including the membership number and all of that. And also, when we initially did it, we focused on a 20% incentive for low income, and it produced no takers. And then we had to do another reevaluation of what some of those barriers were, which is where we're getting to. So on a path forward, we're trying to address those issues, I think, in a positive way. Again, keeping in mind that on top of that layered has to be what some of the impacts are to the reliability and resiliency of the grid, but also a step back to say, what are we doing, and are we actually addressing some of these barriers and actually helping in this program being successful and being one that's a good one for the customers. As to the income eligibility and giving NYSERDA 6 months to file a proposal to allow community DG developers to access an income verification system. I think we're being very generous in that 6 months. NYSERDA already has an income verification program and others. I would not expect this to take that long. And so I'm mindful of the fact that we're being generous in giving them 6 months. I also would say that there continues to be, and it concerns me, and I've spoken about this pretty much every winter season, and now I'll speak here now as we are addressing it, to the extent that we, as sister agencies, continue to have challenges in collaborating and coordinating, and in particular working with OTDA. I think we need to take a good look at how we can help break down those bureaucratic silos, because it seems to me that we've been talking, and there are numerous orders where we have said we expect this agency to work with that agency, and I just, in my mind, we should be figuring out that collaboration in a more thoughtful way and trying to break down whatever silos or resources are not there that need us to get those things done. And, as to this subset of consumers, it's an important one, and it's a vulnerable population. And so we need to make sure that we're doing all we can to make that happen. So I hope within those 6 months that that's also part of the larger goal in addressing. And then as to the loss reserve program for community DG serving low-income subscribers, I am happy to see that there is now a focus in here in NYSERDA filing a report with us on the status of that program. It doesn't go as far as I would like. I would rather the report be filed SAPID and brought to the Commission for action. However, I can't have everything my way, so I get that. It's a joke.
I have to maintain a somber mood.
Yes. So when I look at it, though, I think that the loan loss reserve, and it's one that can be successful. However, I will just pause. We need to be very careful as a governmental agency, a governmental entity, getting involved in loan loss reserve and what that means. The risk is on the ratepayer. And so we need to have a real understanding of that risk and a real understanding of what dollars are being dedicated to that, and make sure that there is proper accountability, and that we're also not winding up creating a problem in a competitive way with potentially outside banks that should be involved in the loan loss reserve, and we're getting involved in potentially something that I think can be tricky. One of the struggles that I have with the New York Green Bank in particular, since this is something that's being looked at for the Green Bank, is I'm not quite sure exactly if they have the right resources to address it from a low-income perspective, and looking at it as this applies to that. To the extent that we can point to other loss reserve type, I say type, that's a type programs in the Green Bank, it's not an apples-to-apples comparison. The $500,000 that is in there, that's the loan loss reserve, or can be deemed a loan loss reserve, really came from, actually, initially, it was the federal money that went into the Green Jobs program and then was transferred over to the Green Bank. So it's not as if we have that to say, okay, well, they got it up and running and made it work, and now they're taking it and applying it to the low income. And so to the extent that we need to make sure during this time period and this report, that this report is really helpful and transparent to all, not just to the Commission, but to all interested stakeholders, and we are open to looking at it and deciding if it is the right fit. So I just want to be sort of cognizant of the fact of my concern and how that bleeds into across the board, looking at all of the different dollars and funding that are being utilized, and again reminding ourselves that it's the ratepayers and it's the risk to the ratepayers, and so we have to be cognizant of that, and get it right. We don't have the luxury to get it wrong. With that, I am going to vote for this item. I am somewhat concerned in some of the challenges and making sure that we are laser focused on trying to work with folks, the developers in particular, from the success of it and wanting them to participate. But then also, it's all about, for me, is this actually benefiting the customers, and is it also being done in a way that is protecting the reliability and resiliency of the grid too. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Alisi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My personal view, if equality isn't offered to everybody in every different way, then there isn't any equality. So this hard work and deep thought that went into this process goes a long way to removing barriers to equality in another area of how we live. So naturally, I'm going to fully support it.
Thank you very much. With that, I will proceed to call for a vote. My vote is in favor of this item, as discussed, to adopt the low-income community distributed generation initiatives. Commissioner Sayre, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
I concur.
Thank you. Commissioner Alisi, how do you vote?
Aye.
The item is approved and recommendations are adopted. We will now proceed to the fourth and final item for discussion, item 302, case 18E0071, which is in the matter of offshore wind energy, presented by David Drexler, Managing Attorney, Rudy Stegemoller, Special Assistant for Energy Policy, and Tom Rienzo, Chief Clean Energy Programs, are available for questions. David, please begin.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Item 302 proposes to adopt an offshore wind standard to assist in meeting the Commission's clean energy standard goal that 50% of New York's electricity needs will be supplied by renewable generation resources in 2030. Specifically, the order adopts a supplementary goal that these generation resources would include the output of 2,400 megawatts of new offshore wind facilities. The order establishes the parameters for a Phase 1 procurement in 2018 and 2019 for offshore wind renewable energy credits, or ORECs, associated with approximately 800 megawatts of offshore wind resources. In practical terms, this item would jumpstart the offshore wind industry in New York in order to secure the benefits of such an industry in our state. It would also accelerate the sharp decline in prices that comes as the market develops, while taking advantage of significant and currently available federal tax incentives. As background, the Commission recognized the substantial potential for offshore wind as part of its order adopting the Clean Energy Standard. However, the Commission requested that the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA, perform a study to identify the appropriate mechanisms to achieve this potential and to make recommendations to the Commission. On January 29, 2018, NYSERDA released the New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan, which reflects extensive public outreach with stakeholders such as commercial and recreational fishermen, consumer advocates, elected officials, labor and business leaders, Long Island and New York City communities, non-governmental organizations, the offshore wind energy industry, and state and federal agencies. The master plan presents a comprehensive roadmap to encourage the development of 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and is supported by 20 studies regarding a variety of environmental, social, economic, regulatory, and infrastructure-related matters. As part of the plan, NYSERDA evaluated a study area of approximately 16,740 square miles that covers a roughly square-shaped area paralleling the coast of Long Island on the north and the continental shelf on the southeast. This area is regulated by the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM, which has entered into 6 lease agreements for wind development in areas along the Atlantic coast between New Jersey and New England. The master plan is supported by NYSERDA's Offshore Wind Policy Options Paper, which was filed with the Commission for consideration. The options paper indicates that offshore wind is projected to provide numerous benefits in addition to playing a significant role in contributing toward achieving the Clean Energy Standard targets and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. For example, because of its proximity and direct access to load centers, offshore wind would provide substantial reliability and diversity benefits to the electric system. Offshore wind also has the potential to create thousands of jobs for New Yorkers, both in construction of the facilities and in the operation and maintenance of the completed projects. Moreover, significant public health benefits could be achieved by displacing fossil fire generation in the downstate area. Recognizing a significant declining cost trend for offshore wind in Europe and other regions where it has been deployed, the options paper recommends 2 phases for offshore wind development. The first phase would jumpstart New York's offshore wind industry by procuring in 2018 and 2019 the environmental attributes associated with approximately 800 megawatts of offshore wind. The remainder of the offshore wind would be procured in future years as the domestic offshore wind industry matures and the expected price declines materialize. The Commission saw comments on the options paper and related issues from interested entities and received a diverse range of views from 42 organizations and numerous individuals. In general, there is widespread support for an offshore wind procurement requirement in the size and time frame proposed in the options paper. Various parties agree that a jumpstart of the offshore wind industry is needed for cost-effective fulfillment of the state's carbon reduction goals generally and the Clean Energy Standard goals in particular. These parties also note the potential for significant economic activity in New York associated with offshore wind. Concerns with respect to an offshore wind procurement were raised with respect to its potential effect on fisheries, the potential for increased electricity prices, and the initiative's potential impact on competitive markets. These concerns are addressed in the draft order. As laid out in the order before you, there are compelling reasons for adopting an offshore wind standard and authorizing a Phase 1 procurement at this time. Achieving the state's ambitious carbon reduction goals will require the deployment of various resources, and offshore wind has the potential to provide a significant contribution toward that objective. It has been estimated that the deployment of 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind would account for approximately 1/3 of the state's carbon reduction goals sought through the Clean Energy Standard by the 50 by 30 goal. Furthermore, offshore wind addresses the transmission and siting constraints that would otherwise inhibit the development of renewable power in the downstate area and has a higher capacity factor than other weather variable renewable sources of generation. It is particularly well suited for the Atlantic coast, from siting and operations to system efficiency and potential output. Clean power delivered into New York will also have the effect of displacing fossil fuel generation and reducing air contaminants. In continuity with the Clean Energy Standard, NYSERDA would serve as the procurement agent for ORECs. However, NYSERDA would coordinate its procurement with the New York Power Authority and the Long Island Power Authority. In the initial phase, ORECs associated with the output of approximately 800 megawatts would be procured over a 2-year period, with the first solicitation issued in the 4th quarter of 2018. This schedule would allow developers to take advantage of the investment tax credit prior to its expiration. The costs of the ORECs that are procured as part of Phase 1 would be recovered from each load-serving entity, or LSE, throughout the state, based on the LSE's proportional share of retail loads served. NYSERDA estimates the typical bill impacts associated with a 400-megawatt OREC procurement would be between 0.11% and 0.41% in 2024 for the first year of operation. Using the index procurement option recommended in the order as a reference, the incremental bill impact associated with an 800-megawatt OREC procurement would be approximately 0.18% in 2025. This equates to less than 76 cents per month for a typical residential customer. As detailed in the order, the procurement method would involve a hybrid approach whereby NYSERDA would solicit 2 separate bids from each participating bidder. One bid would be for a fixed price OREC, while the other bid would be based on a variable OREC tied to an index. The 2 bids would be weighted using a formula that is clearly articulated in the solicitation. In order to contain costs, a price benchmark, commonly referred to as an upset price, would be used in the bid evaluation process. This approach is similar to the method used in the Renewable Energy Standard Tier 1 procurements. NYSERDA would presumptively reject any bid higher than the confidential benchmark price and would, at all times, have authority to reject any and all bids, taking into account not only the benchmark upset price, but also recent auctions and market conditions. In evaluating the bids, NYSERDA would apply a relative weight of 70% to price, 20% to economic benefits, and 10% to project viability. NYSERDA would have discretion in fixing specific contract terms which would apply for not less than 20 years nor more than 25 years. With respect to the concerns raised by the fishing industry, the final generic environmental impact statement notes that the construction and operation of 2,400 megawatts of wind energy in areas offshore of New York would restrict or affect fishing within only 3% of the area, leaving large areas available without conflicts for fishing. Regarding visual impacts, maintaining a minimum distance from shore is critically important for the public acceptance of this program, as well as maintaining the economic and societal value of onshore locations, including public recreational spaces. Therefore, NYSERDA would include a setback requirement taking into consideration that a 20-mile setback from any coastal position would eliminate visual impacts under most daylight conditions. Finally, the draft order would require that eligible developers have a lease from BOEM and can ensure delivery of their energy into the New York control region. While developers will ultimately be responsible for providing the generation and transmission facilities necessary to ensure the renewable energy is delivered to New York, developers may partner with independent transmission projects as appropriate. With respect to Phase 2, Department of Public Service staff and NYSERDA will convene a technical conference by September 2018 to explore the optimal configurations for cost-effective transmission of large-scale offshore wind development and the various options for ownership and planning processes. This concludes staff's presentation for item 302. Rudy Stegemiller, Tom Rienzo, and I are available to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, David. It's been our state's policy, and in my view, an extremely correct policy, to invest in a state in resources when and as they become viable and valuable and generally ready for prime time. By this standard, offshore wind is a compelling and timely resource based on considerations of economics, as you've described, the scale and quantity that's available to the state, as you've described, the quality of the resource, and the location, as you've described. The phased and recommended path seems intelligently structured for this opportunity and for dealing with the well-recognized stakeholder concerns, and it's intelligently aligned with the CES. And the immediate phase of procuring approximately 800 megawatts, as described, is a smart and important investment in our energy future, as well as a great boost more broadly to our clean energy economy. I am evidently going to support this item.
I support this item for 3 reasons. First, in my view, we need offshore wind if we're going to achieve our clean energy goals. It's as simple as that. Secondly, based on the information that was summarized in the presentation and is also in the draft order, the incremental costs to ratepayers in the short run is likely to be relatively minimal. Third, in the long run, the benefits to the state are likely to be enormous, far in excess of the incremental costs of setting up, of jump-starting this industry in New York State. In particular, the economic benefits to the state can be very large indeed in terms of increased economic activity and jobs. Offshore wind is a success in Europe, and it can be a success in New York. We're in a race right now with our fellow states along the eastern seaboard to get the staging and fabrication facilities for this new industry built in our state. Of course, they want it in their state. I think it would be appropriate for us to get moving quickly and win this one for New York.
Thank you. Commissioner Berman.
So I understand that folks have been focused on the fact that we're in a race, but as someone who's really been focused on looking at both the short-term and the long-term implications, I have to take a step back because it seems like one of the threshold issues is it right for us to try to be first, and what is the implications for that? So for me, this item I have many questions on. I have much in concerns, both positive and negative, and I don't think it fits squarely in the overall scheme. So for me, I want to take a pause so that we're ready for and have the tools and resources we need to really do what's right for our state, but for all of us, even outside of our state, and really think about it. Is it so bad if we don't win and we actually win by working in collaboration with others? Is it necessary for us to have to be, what some would see as top dog? Is it about the state, or is it about the development of a program where people can participate and have economic benefit, and looking at it from a core holistic approach? And then it isn't just the offshore wind. There are many other aspects that come with that. And so for many ways, I want to make sure that we're keeping in mind the overall picture. This is related to, in many ways, matched up with or springboard from the Clean Energy Standard. And when we did that in August of 2016, it was August 1st, 2016, actually. We all recognized, the commission at that time, and spoke on the record, all of the commissioners, about the need for fuel diversity and the need to look at this as a whole and how it works. And to the extent that we have are challenged with some the newness of it, the legalities around that, and working through that, we have to be mindful now when we do an add-on to that and have now a new thing, in this case OREX. So it's important for me to take a pause and look back. I went back to the transcript in August of 2016, listened carefully. All of us spoke specifically about fuel diversity. The majority of us spoke about natural gas also being a part of that, transmission being a part of that, nuclear, and renewables, and the integration of that. We also talked about the state resource planning that was supposed to be undertaken and looked at, state resource plan, and how that would integrate, and the real need to make sure that we had proper systems planning. It's not lost on me that we're doing this in July, and that from my perspective, in July, I am always reminded of the blackout of 1977 and the systems planning that happened after that and working through it, and the need for a wide variety of resources and tools and looking at that. So I am somewhat concerned that we are going full steam ahead without also, because we want to win the race, without also looking and saying, are we carefully evaluating and carefully looking at it and carefully asking some of the hard questions in terms of the drill down in costs and that. I know that recently there was an announcement of the consortium. The DOE gave, and this is from public information, $18.5 million for a consortium on R&D, and with that came an obligation for the state to match that, and that comes from the Clean Energy Fund. And that is really, that's R&D that's focused on trying to help reduce the costs of technology for offshore wind. And that's a good thing, looking at how we can marshal our resources, whether or not you agree on what the right share is for the state. The fact that there's a look at a consortium and a wide variety of folks engaged in looking at reducing those costs and the R&D around that, and the support between the feds and the state, and the collaboration that's there. The opportunity for that collaboration is there, and the wide group of stakeholders that are coming together to address that issue. But those resources being spent won't be seen, and the benefits of that won't be seen until a few years out. So that means whatever we do on this first phase to jumpstart the market won't necessarily be aligned with the opportunity for reduced costs to that technology that may be there. So it's the first adopters, and to the extent that the state and the government is also involved in being a part of that from a fiscal perspective, we may actually be spending more money than if we took a pause and waited to some of the realization that's hoped for from that consortium comes to light to reduce that. One of the things that is important to me is that we also make sure when we are looking at that and issuing, when NYSERDA or LIPA and NYPA issue their procurements, that they are carefully and properly evaluating the need to incorporate that potential drawdown for other new technologies and reduce costs, so that we're not locking ourselves in to a procurement that may not have the benefit of that reduced cost, and we actually wind up paying more, and that comes to the ratepayers who wind up paying more. So I am sensitive to that issue. There is wording in this order that talks about the fact that NYSERDA can reject any bids that come in, doesn't have to accept. And so I would think that that would be utilized, or I'm encouraging, since it's not expressed, that that is utilized in also being thoughtful about this part of it, and before it goes out, also have some thought in language in terms of addressing those issues, so that the fiscal responsibility is there. If we wind up locking ourselves in, there is an opportunity for those to be backed out in some fashion. So I just want to make sure that we carefully think about that and what the proper mix is without causing ourselves to say we spent more if we had just waited to the second phase. We would have been better, and the first adopters would have been better suited. So then we get to the legal authority, and there's wording in the order that says that we have clear legal authority, and cites to a number of generic sections of the law, the Public Service Law, the New York Energy Law, and I do think that we have authority. I do think that we have, but I'm not so sure that we could say it's clear. And why do I take a pause with that? Why is that important? Because we do need to recognize that this is a jurisdictional creep in many ways. We are looking at a new program, and I don't think we should be so cavalier about the fact that we can do it because, and cite to the general provisions of that without taking sort of a careful deep dive into what is the overall goal and how does it fit in the scheme of things. So for me, to the extent that many times since I've been here, since the State Energy Plan, the 2015 State Energy Plan has been adopted, it's been cited as the rationale for numerous things that we do. And that's appropriate. 2015 State Energy Plan is something that we should look at and have as guidance. And there's energy law that speaks of the agencies, and in particular the Commission, utilizing that and appropriately setting forth its programs and policies and decision-making based on that. But for me, the thing that weighs on me is the actual specifics of what gave us the law to adopt that 2015 State Energy Plan. And I just really want to remind folks that the law is pretty robust in what the State Energy Plan must incorporate, what the State Energy Plan is supposed to do. And in fact, if you go to the law that is the underpinning of the specific legislation that's the underpinning for the 2015 State Energy Plan, we need to be mindful that the energy plan is to be done every 4 years. In the 2015 case, it was 2 years late. So if we go with the 4 years starting from the late date, that means 2019. But the state energy law, state energy plan that's devoted to it, 6-104 for the energy law, also goes into the need for every 2 years to have a biannual report. It also gives flexibility if you want to do a state energy plan more than every 4 years, you can do that. I don't think that's happening, but just saying. But what I found interesting to me is that what isn't really sort of focused on is all of the different things in the actual legislation that's in there that the state energy plan is supposed to incorporate. And it goes beyond just the renewable piece. So what gets cited a lot is the renewable factor. But actually, it isn't about now taking that and then modifying what we're doing to be in compliance with the state energy plan. And the state energy plan can be whatever we want it to be. In actuality, the specifics of the law talk very much about fuel diversity in particular, and about reliability and resiliency. It talks about looking at the projections of and forecasting for electric demand, gas demand, supply, making sure we have adequate resources, looking at transmission, looking at customers, what's the appropriate amount that utilities have. Very specific, very detailed, very technically important to the reliability and resiliency of our energy. And it sets forth for me the bigger framework that we need to keep in mind, and something that I think is really important. Now, I think in many ways what I'm concerned about is that because we are not geared up right now for a robust and energy plan and engagement on that, because also this energy law talks about the resources that are needed, not just the fiscal resources, but the resources that are needed for this detailed analysis and engaging with that. We're actually not doing a service to the consumer if we're not focused on what we need to do to meet that, but we're also not following the law, which requires detailed analysis. And so we need to be mindful of looking at that and having, again, systems planning so that we are carefully weighing it and looking at what we can do. Now, to the extent that when I look to the ISO, they're the ones who are the technical resources for the State Energy Planning Board. And the ISO is trying to engage in numerous different things for the systems planning, and all of the different state entities are also, and stakeholders, have an opportunity to work with them. Most recently, in the public list of the ISO's work, they're looking at the enhancing fuels and security, and it talks in their plan this study for 2019 projects, enhancing fuel and energy security. It's to examine fuel and energy security for the bulk power system over a 10-year horizon in order to assess potential grid resilience concerns. The ISO appreciates stakeholder concerns related to a wide range of potential grid resilience risk, including extreme weather scenarios and climate change impacts. It's incorporating the old with the new. It's making a focus on, we are looking at our grid, we are looking at this, and we are looking at what we can do with our impact. ISO's concerned future changes to New York's fuel supply mix, as well as the expected increased demands for natural gas, may challenge the ability to meet electric system demands under certain stress system conditions, such as a prolonged cold weather event and our natural gas supply transportation disruptions. The study would also report on similar fuel and energy security studies and initiatives underway by other ISOs and RTOs. Important reminder, it's not just about New York, it's about looking at what it is outside of New York and working in that collaborative way. And depending on the results of the study, the ISO would facilitate the subsequent development of recommendations for potential operational and/or capacity and energy market enhancements necessary to achieve desired improvements in grid resiliency as related to fuel and energy security. So I see that as pretty important in part of trying to map out some of the system planning, system resources, how it might fit with offshore wind, what the connection is, how it fits with transmission. So I share that with you, not as a naysayer, but really as someone who's focused on it. We can't be continually talking in siloed treatment of our energy, so that when we are talking, we are focused on how it also is working in alignment with and trying to collaborate and work through those challenges. So for me, the authority to do this is with a recognition that it is not then just go away, but actually all the other things need to be worked through and properly aligned with, and to have that right system planning to focus on that. So one of the challenges that we have is how do we do that properly? I'm not sure that jump-starting this market in doing this from 2018 and jumping in is the right thing. But I also could be wrong. And so it's important for us to not be handicapped in just taking a seat back. So we need to be able to work through that. One of the challenges and the reasons are given for jump-starting it, not only from an economic development perspective, but also is because of the federal tax credit and the fear that the ITC will go away in 2019. I remind folks that that was the same rationale used for the solar tax credit and the need for us to jumpstart that back in 2013, 2014. And that, after much advocacy, didn't go away. And to the extent that we haven't then come back and made sort of careful analysis on some of our focus and what that may mean, I just pause because we don't know what's going to happen with the 2019 ITC. Maybe it does go away, maybe it doesn't. But there was a recognition, again, that a lot of times there are things and credits or enhancements or incentives that are supposed to have a natural shelf life. And so we need to also look at that. So we also need to remind ourselves that while we have the fear of that going away, it may not, but it also may mean that we need to look at what that means. And again, is it the worst thing if we have from this consortium some lowered cost technology, and also as first adopters we're going to make some mistakes, so it might not necessarily, it's not necessary for us to be doing it right at the get-go. But we do need to work together. Now we get to the NIPA-LIPA conundrum. I am concerned about us and the uncertainty that I see and the ambiguity in exactly what we're directing or not directing, what we're saying we hope NIPA and LIPA does. Now, as a threshold matter, it is not lost on me that every time that we do something as it relates to REV, in this case offshore wind, NIPA and LIPA and Clean Energy Standard, NIPA and LIPA have adopted what we've recommended. In fact, the LIPA board had publicly stated at one point that they looked to the REV initiatives and that they intended to, for the most part, incorporate into their planning and then adopt. So that, to me, is a conundrum because we don't necessarily have oversight over NIPA and LIPA. We also don't know what they're going to do outside of that they see as alignment. I may see differently as it relates to what we're doing. And I also think that there is some confusion. We're giving LIPA and NIPA more choices than we are NYSERDA. LIPA and NIPA may even be able to be a part of the NYSERDA procurement and then do their other. In some ways, it may be unfair. But also, as it gets back to, for me, why do we need them to be also able to do their own procurements? Why can't, if we're doing it through NYSERDA and we're we're working together. Why do we need to give them this other thing? Not only is, in my mind, is it maybe causing more overhead from an administrative perspective, it may be rather clunky and confusing because you're going to have people have to spend more time in figuring out all the different scenarios and the different players. And I just pause in that I don't think that this is necessarily the best approach. And I would rather see NYPA and LIPA from the get-go have to tell us what they tend to do and be part of the decision-making from when we're looking at it and adopting the next phase. We saw that clunkiness in CES and the confusion that caused in NYPA putting out a procurement and NYSERDA putting out a procurement. And I would like to see that we have less clunkiness and more thoughtfulness, and also to the extent that from an oversight perspective, it concerns me because I'm not necessarily, the commission is not necessarily having a handle on all that goes on with that because it's separate and apart from us. So I raise that because I think it's concerning. I also believe, which is different from probably the majority view, that if LIPA and NYPA decide to be a part of a state program that is part of the commission and looking at it, we do have oversight more so than we did, and that there is an opportunity for us to weigh in more, not just through DPS, but through the commission itself. And I think that that is important because it is going to the overall objective of looking at the rollout of coordination with state energy objectives and plans, and is something that they should welcome. They have the ability to say, yes, we are coming in voluntarily and being a part of this oversight. And I think that that is something that they should very much consider, because I think it gets rid of a lot of the mystery and confusion that sometimes abounds, and working in collaboration and more resources, frankly, and more engagement with the NYPA and the LIPA board may actually be beneficial to all of us and help us. The working groups, what is the envisionment of how that works in terms of the oversight? You know, as my concern, the order speaks to having technical working groups and working through things, but it's through NYSERDA, not DPS. Why is it through NYSERDA and not DPS? What's the rationale with that?
Well, it's part of NYSERDA's overall administration of the program.
So how does it come then for us for the oversight of the administration in terms of under the umbrella of the commission? How does that work?
I mean, staff will participate in the in the working groups, and it'll come back to the commission in the form of phase 2 proposals.
Okay. I just have pause because I am particularly concerned that when some working groups are very good, helpful, and then others, whether it's a working group or a council or others, wind up needing some more oversight and hand-holding. And to the extent that we are in this order allowing working groups, I'm mindful that we had done that with the advisory council, and a lot of different working groups happened, and then a lot of actions happened sort of that maybe was a lot of work that was not necessarily, while it may be good, it became sort of a massive amount of work that never really got flushed out from over the commission, and it actually delved into, in many of these advisory council working groups, which we've addressed, we've cleaned that up, that it wound up morphing into addressing much more than was sort of the clear intent from the order itself.
Yeah, and NYSERDA will issue a report to the commission following the first round of contract awards, and the status of working groups ought to be included in that report. And the commission obviously is always available as a resource if someone wants to bring a petition. There's no specific commission action contemplated here as a follow-up on the working groups, other than phase 2.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That's helpful. I do think that one of the overall objections to this is about costs and the upward rate pressure that ensues. And for me, I do think that the overall issue, and it's not just in offshore wind, but it happens to be across the board, that we do need to be very cognizant that this is a legitimate concern, that the upward rate pressure of costs is something that we are challenged with, and if we continue on the current trajectory, it is unsustainable and will be significant. And therefore, we need to really look across the board at what we're doing. In here, a lot of the ORECs don't start, so we have time, allegedly. My pause for concern is that we need to get back to that system planning and look at it overall as it matches up. We've seen in the ZECs where we've had some concerns with ZEC payments. We have an item on here with figuring it out and what that means from a customer perspective. But we also see it in terms of some of our forecasting and needing to realign with that. So to the extent that we have some criticism from opponents to what we're doing, I don't think that they're opposed to trying to make things work from a state energy system planning. They have legitimate concerns to say that we may not be fully and carefully evaluating the true costs and the true need to get a handle on that now. I know that there's been outside of here, that there's been in particular, for example, the Village of Rockville Center. And the reason I raise it is because one of the parties is the Sustainability Institute at Malloy, which happens to be in Rockville Center and also happens to be my alma mater. But one of the things reason I raise it is because their latest filing from the Village of Rockville Center that they have on the computations of their fuel clauses and looking at the costs for May of 2018, factoring in the RECs and the ZECs and the ISO ICAP and ISO charges, ISO energy, NIPA, and then fuel used in generation, is startling. And also for me is, and again, this is public and it's filed, but it also explains some of their concerns that they have and their criticisms of what we're doing. And the Sustainability Institute in Malloy also raises concerns on costs. as well as other entities. So for me, it's about trying to make those connections in what's going on and how that works, and also because it's in LIPA's footprint, Long Island, knowing that some of these issues as it relates, especially if LIPA does a procurement down there, may be outside of my oversight and reach, and that's why I have some concern. I may be wrong in that, but I raise it only because I think it's important for us to have some thoughtful conversation on all of that and look at now how does this fold in. Offshore wind cannot be done without other fuels, transmission, etc. I'm also mindful of the fact that some folks nationally who are interested in offshore wind also sees that they want to have a diverse portfolio. GE in particular had public announcement about their support of offshore wind as well as gas, and others have talked about it too. And we have challenges. It's not lost on me that we will have to go through not just the commission on certain things, but the Article 10 board, and the factors that go into the need for community engagement and others. And all of these things will put concerns and pressures and other things there that may stymie some of what we're trying to do. And we can't, as we saw with onshore, or as we see with onshore wind, it's not necessarily, without its challenges. And, and especially in the offshore case, if it's in the Long Island footprint, the fishermen, and their concerns, it's very real, very important to look at and to take into consideration in a real way. Growing up on Long Island, that was that I know the vibrancy of that community and the need for addressing that issue. So next we come to, excuse me, the issues with the fact that we have in here also allowed for PLAs and our prevailing wage in procurements. This will be the first time that the commission does that. It's not the first time that it's been addressed. NYSERDA on its own had in the last procurement, 18 I believe, prevailing wage provisions in there. My concern is that there are parties who have expressed concern with the upward pressure of costs on that. But more so is that I'm not sure that while we may have under some general provisions the jurisdictional authority, and I say may, I'm not sure that it's wise for us to have in many ways usurped the legislative process to decide on that aspect of it. But I'm also concerned, even if we allow it here, and again, it doesn't mean it has to be, what that means in terms of the forward trajectory as it applies to whether or not we then will ask utilities outside of offshore wind to have prevailing wages and PLAs, and that's not in our wheelhouse, and we need more thoughtful conversation on that issue. And there has been legislation that has been dealt with that. Some has passed, some has not, and dealt with those issues. But to the extent that, again, we need to have a more thoughtful and idea of what it means and what the benefits and the negatives are to that, I think it's important. And so I am particularly troubled by that, not because I disagree if this ultimately is, but that it is something that I think is requires more thoughtfulness and more proper alignment of our jurisdictional reach that I think we may have crossed. And so I take that seriously. To the extent that we do have in the order some parameters about taking into consideration that as they move forward in the procurement, I think that's helpful. To the extent that we also recognize that we should be looking at that, I think it's helpful. The piece that is also troubling is there was this week a petition for addressing the carbon pricing issue from multiple interveners and from IPNI. Not troubled by the petition. I'm actually think it raises a legitimate issue, flushes it out a little more to what was in the papers. What's interesting to me is that the two parties came together and thought it was important enough to do as a petition. It goes beyond the offshore wind. It's also in other referencing other cases. But it is something that we need to take into consideration. Where are we? What does it mean? In many ways, we are saying, well, that's an ISO issue, so we'll wait for them to do their careful analysis. Again, going back to how it all relates and what that means, are we, in a sense, by not addressing it, potentially handicapping it with another barrier, something for us to consider in our sort of resource planning and looking at it, and also looking at it from the focus on reducing emissions, and also the focus on how does this work from a alignment with other incentives and other subsidies. So I think that's important for us to consider. Where I come from overall is that despite my concerns and reservations on some of these issues and my the challenges, I do think we have opportunities that we need to look forward to. We need to work together. I am cognizant that energy regulation is a continual process, and to do it right, we must strive to work together. For me, this is not a siloed process, and this aspects in here need to be carefully aligned with our other energy goals. If we take to heart the comments that were said at session August 1st, 2016, there was a recognition again that fuel diversity was important, and that we needed to work together from a systems planning, and resiliency and reliability was important. And we need to make sure that we are doing what's needed from an energy planning perspective, and that we are not necessarily following the shiny object because we're focused on being the winners, but we're actually being thoughtful in doing what we need to do from economic energy regulators and looking at all of the mix and making sure we're attending to all of it, short-term and long-term. And the most key thing for me is the customer, and we need to get a handle on those costs. And we need to make sure that we are carefully working together and collaborating so that things that we're doing actually wind up coming into fruition, and that we are helping to create markets, incentivize markets, but not tear down markets, and not stifle markets. And the competitive market is important, and I think that we need to work through those challenges and look at that. And I would hope that people are focused on the overall goal of being mindful of the importance of fuel diversity and collaborating together in a positive way, because I don't think it's helpful to continue in trying to silo one group from another and picking some as good and some as evil. And that is a problem. To the extent that, again, going back to EIA's forecasting and the demands, the energy demands that will come, and to the extent that we have significant needs that we need to address from the get-go to make sure that we are secure, and we need to do that in a way that's thoughtful and economic and environmentally sound. So with that, I will be concurring with reservation on this item, and I do hope that we take pause in the overall scheme and remember that we need to get back to looking at our core objectives of the whole system and the integration of all of that together, and working with folks in a way that gets us to a forward path rather than many times seeming to be angry if someone raises legitimate concerns. It doesn't mean because people disagree with what we're doing in a particular way that they're against fuel diversity or they're against renewables. They just may not think that we're doing it necessarily in the best way. And we should take thoughtful stock of that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Lisi?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd have to admit that I'm one of those people that way back initially wasn't very fond of the idea of wind-generated power. Living in the Finger Lakes when the first wind farm popped up, many people didn't like it visually. It wasn't very appealing. But as you grow to understand that this industry has evolved, and we've learned so much from not only the way they operate, but from the siting of these things, that things are being done much better. This is a massive scale project, which I truly believe that we need, and there's no question that we need to do this. It is proven technology with identifiable drawbacks, but it is proven technology, and so much thought and planning is going into it, has gone into it, that the success, I believe, is predictable. I do have some concerns down the road when we look at the cost of energy to the consumer, that it might be impacted with this plan as it relates to labor costs and things of that nature in that particular market, but only time will tell on that issue. I agree with Commissioner Sayer that this could be a win for New York. I think more that New York could be a world leader if we accomplish this and accomplish it very well. Other areas, other regions can learn from us, and they can install and employ their own wind generation facilities as well. It is clean energy. We can't lose sight of that fact. And I think we're close enough to the point where we can get, at least I can, get my arms around this and want to proceed with the plan as it's being given to us here. And hopefully as we go forward that we'll have other opportunities to provide clean energy for the people not only in New York State but worldwide. So I'll be voting yes.
Thank you. So I'll just make one remark before we proceed to the vote, which is thank you, fellow commissioners. Your points around, the points you've made are very well taken around the importance of good systems planning, around a holistic takes across resources and actors. We need to get the future right, and we will as it relates to Phase 2. And I think with Phase 1 we're getting the present or the near-term future right. But I know we take those tasks very, very seriously. So with that, I will proceed to calling for a vote. My own vote is in favor of the recommendation to adopt and establish the offshore wind standard and framework for Phase 1 procurement as discussed. Commissioner Sayer, how do you vote?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
I concur based on my comments.
Thank you. Commissioner Lisi, how do you vote?
Aye.
The item is approved and the recommendations are adopted. We will now move to the consent agenda. Do any commissioners wish to comment on or recuse from voting on any items on the consent agenda? Commissioner Berman?
Thank you. I'd like to comment on item number 364, which is the Energy Storage Deployment Program. Just like to recognize that this is confirming a one-commissioner order, and here we are just voting on the draft GEIS and not on the underlying matters that will come before us. The Energy Storage Roadmap, aka Staff White Paper, is on a separate track and will need to be SAPA noticed for comments. And I expect, in line with the legislation PSL Section 74 and Commission precedent, will then come before the entire Commission body as a whole for a decision.
Thank you. With that, I will call for a vote on the consent agenda. My vote is in favor of the recommendations on the consent agenda. Commissioner Sayer?
Aye.
Commissioner Berman?
Aye.
Commissioner Alisi?
Aye.
The items are approved and the recommendations are adopted. Secretary Burgess, is there anything further to come before us today?
There is nothing further to come before you today, and the next commission meeting is on August 9th.
Thank you very much. With that, we are adjourned.